Joseph G. Story 1. I was lodging in a family-run cabin in Canada. It wasn't particularly large orphancy, just something my grandparents constructed and maintained, so occasionally, and this was shortly after the new year, and once more, a family member would love a vacation there. I intended to spend 3 nights at the cabin, which was located on an off-the-grid property in the middle of nowhere area. I needed to use a snowmobile to reach, which was typical at this time of year when after arriving. I quickly set up my belongings in the bedroom and turned on the wood stove. I began to experience the sense of relief I had hoped for. As time seemed to pass more slowly occasionally, I had nothing to occupy my thoughts, so I could simply relax and savor the tranquility that remained for the remainder of that day and night. It was pleasant to get up at sunrise and prepare breakfast on the wood stove, and as I opened the door, I bundled up to go outside and get more wood. I was surprised to see footsteps in the snow coming straight up to the front door. I went straight outside the cottage and took a quick look around before I pursued them for some time before they led into the woods. Showing no signs of approaching, how could they be out here on a road that was miles away? Not ride a snowmobile. And why they were here in the first place, I was very perplexed, particularly since they had to arrive at the cabin in the middle of the night. Otherwise, I heard them in the morning, so I carried some wood inside from the shed that I considered leaving, but I reasoned that if they stopped by and did nothing, then considering how difficult it was to travel to and from the cabin, it must have been an accident to have rendered my journey a complete waste. So I sat by the fire and simply watched for the next few hours. But I didn't see finally. I tossed my jacket aside as the sun rose higher and the temperature rose up back on, and wanted to kill time with a stroll in the woods. So I made the decision that I might as well use this chance to see whether the footprints are LED anyplace. Perhaps I could locate another cabin or anything that would calm me down. So I followed them into the forest, and I think I wandered for 20 minutes without seeing anything. Only a single unbroken line of footprints in the snow across the forest, until 2 jerked my head up and glanced forward when I heard something was abruptly silent, and all that remained were endless woods. There was no mistaking what I heard. The crunch of a footstep for snow, knowing that there was someone out there in front of me gave me goosebumps all over. I must have been lurking behind one of the trees because they only barely noticed me. Hello, is anyone out? Quick head, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where I was, there was no answer, not even a sound. And as the strain increased, I made the decision to turn around and sprint back to the cabin because I had to do something. I hurriedly packed everything, secure the cabin, and return the snowmobile to the way. I'm not sure what transpired at the cabin or what was anticipated, but without a doubt, the individual who visited in the middle of the night was the same one who was in the woods. It was no accident, as evidenced by the route back to my accommodation. I haven't returned to the cabin following that. The second story, written by Anonymous. Every year at the end of February, my dear friend Justin and I go camping at the same spot. We both do a lot of things. However, there was always something unique and pleasant about camping in a snowy woodland with the appropriate equipment. It wasn't too dangerous either. This year, we arrived and put up. It wasn't too long after our tents, set up a campfire, and had a few drinks around the flames. When we finally arrived, we heard a terrible sound. A dark scream, and the sound of the distant reverberated through the landscape for a brief moment. Then it became quiet once more, and we both leaped from our seats. Though we were scared since it seemed too distant to even stand a chance of identifying who it was, yet we turned our gaze there. Anyway, Justin seemed to assume that since there was no animal generating the uncanny human voice, was very certain it had to be a human being, because there was another person out here, beauty in any case other than waiting to hear it. We had no idea what to do about it. Once more, a long time went by with nothing new. The sun began to drop, and the temperature began to drop. We gathered additional wood to add to the fire, prepare dinner. But then suddenly that cry, it seemed to be closer, perhaps only 200 feet, than our camp. Justin and I exchanged glances, both of us thinking that we ought to see it before the sun went down. Took my knife as a precaution, and we both wrapped up before making our way into the woods, trying to move slowly because we weren't sure how to proceed. We may have gone 150 feet out when we were walking up on what way, paused and gazed in that direction after hearing it again from almost next to us. Direction, but nothing was visible. I looked at Justin, and he appeared as we must have stood motionless and waited there for over 5 minutes until Justin arrived. As anxious as I was, Dot began to move ahead slowly once more, passing a few trees before he abruptly halted, and I could tell from his body language that he was afraid. I moved to stand beside him, and it nearly puked because there was a dead deer lying in the snow, which was undoubtedly having Justin's hand tap my shoulder after I had just been placed down to raise my eyes and saw a figure standing across the trees. He was observing us while standing there with barely any cold clothes on. Justin tapped harder on my shoulder, perhaps watching us, Dot, and I realized what he meant. We both departed and quickly returned to our tent. Didn't even talk as we hurriedly packed our belongings and left the area. I don't believe there's any justification for what we observed, the identity of the person out there, or even whether that was the after hearing someone screaming. We left our camping location and found a new region in the hopes of never encountering anything similar. Story 3. Written by V. Once more, the day before Christmas Eve, I got into my car and was approximately 11 p.m. DoorDash deliveries would bring in some better tips over the Christmas season. When I received this request was straightforward. Just a bag of food to be delivered to their home. In reality, the majority of my prior orders were grocery deliveries. Most likely due to businesses closing for the next 2 days, the address was much farther away than I typically am eager to drive, but since there weren't many other orders coming in, I accepted it in any case. The roads were extremely calm, and it was snowing softly outside, making the drive calmly. But when I arrived, I noticed that the house wasn't in a typical area. What I believed to be the neighborhood's entrance turned out to be a narrow walkway through the trees, with a tiny cabin at the end that seemed home. So I parked and pulled over. I approached the door and knocked a couple times after taking the food out. I could hear voices within, like if everyone was laughing and talking over one another. Other persons sounded so similar that I was truly perplexed as to how they could fit in such a tiny home, and there was. Also an oddity in the manner it sounded like something wasn't quite right. Off. The door opened, and a man appeared before me, and I was briefly put off by the interior of the house, because it was different from what I had anticipated. Remained still, no one was rushing around, and the majority of the lights weren't even on. Yet the noise of a massive holiday celebration was emanating from the man grinned at me and said, "Why don't you come bring the food inside?" The room at the end of the hallway, I started stuttering as I tried to say, "I'm glad to see you," to refuse and offer an explanation, but the men interjected, saying they simply wanted to express gratitude. "You'll be happy you came by all the time for working during the holidays," was saying these odd, quite unsettling things, and the background buzz the cabin went going until it abruptly stopped suddenly. The cabin was silent, as if a cassette or recording had ceased playing. The man glanced back for a brief while, obviously unprepared for that to occur. Andy left the bag on the porch before he could do anything, hurried back to my car, got in, and drove away. I stayed at home for the remainder of the holidays and stopped making deliveries for the night. I really don't know anything that occurred at the cabin, yet everything was so eerily bizarre, and the possibilities of what may have occurred continue to frighten me. Story 4. Unidentified. I worked at a tiny family-run grocery store the day after Christmas. Store as an overnight stalker. I have no idea why I was assigned to this particular night. There wasn't much for me to accomplish because we were closed for Christmas and business was probably pretty slow during the day. In terms of stocking, I filled in the few spaces that needed to be filled on the shelves, but when I passed the front, I kind of just strolled about of the store. I saw someone outdoors who was oddly near the structure for this. He appeared to be strolling around at this hour of the night, but he soon recognized me. Observing him, and rather turning away, he moved toward the window. Felt really awkward since he just gazed at me without saying anything or trying to knock. I was unsure of what to do. I turned after a few seconds of him, maintaining eye contact. I moved away from the window. It was really odd, but I suppose I was just trying to act unconcerned. I waited a few minutes before leaving, though, because no normal person behaves that way. He was gone when I returned to the store's front and peered out the window. I let out a sigh of relief and carried on exploring the store to kill time. Around the aisles and repairing a few shelves, perhaps 10 minutes had gone by when I stopped walking as soon as I turned the curve at the end of one of the aisles, since there were multiple boxes that were strewn on the floor after falling from the shelf. They weren't little items either that might have simply tipped over. Someone had to have moved them or knocked them down. Just as while I was trying to comprehend it, I heard a faint yet near the end of the song. There's a deep, eerie laugh that sounds like a man laughing quietly. Aisle. It sounded almost strange, like an adult laughing like a kid, and I considered confronting him. But after recalling the man I saw at the window, they were quite large and might have concealed something in their jacket. So I hurried to the front and left the doors, climbed into my car, and called the police, who arrived 10 minutes later. And we eventually spoke with the security guard after the individual inside the business left tapes, and he managed to enter by a side entrance. He then hid behind the aisle, laughing at me, while brandishing a knife. Police believe he wasn't sober because of the little switchblade in his hand, and while I do not disagree, I do not believe it alters anything. I could have died that evening if circumstances had been different. Story 5. Alan, I've never been a huge party animal, but on special occasions like New Year's Eve, peer pressure nearly always persuaded me to go out. And this year, my friend was regarded as the rich buddy since he had a large house with property and everything, and he was throwing a party at his house. Around 99, my friend Trav grabbed me up, and we drove to the party, where there were only around 20 or 30 people. We played some drinking games and watched the ball drop, which was insane, but enough to make me drink more than I should have. And it was enjoyable all around 3 in the morning. Even though I was prepared to depart, but I discovered Trav unconscious on an upstairs bed, assuming that he had most likely no one when I stepped outside and requested an Uber. It claimed that everyone else here was sober enough to drive that I sat on the curb at the end of the driveway and waited since they were 10 minutes away and his house wasn't that close to any major roads, which was excellent because it was somewhat remote from everything and peaceful that I simply sat there and cuddled up beneath my blanket to unwind after a night like that. Jacket. And after what seemed like only 4 or 5 minutes of waiting for a ride, an automobile when the man called out as I pulled up Uber, I jumped up and hopped in, somewhat surprised by, I guess I was so inebriated that I lost track of time and settled into the back seat. And he began driving. The man had short, brown hair and appeared to be in his 50s. He said, "Oh yeah, with a thick beard and a large party tonight." I think so. Even if I wasn't much in a mood for small talk, I answered. Looked at me in a mirror, and I'm not sure why, but something about the expression he gave me made me uneasy to understand why I put my head back at the time, believing I was just overanalyzing it. And tried to sleep for the rest of the ride by closing my eyes. But only Amy's phone rang a minute later, and I instantly opened my eyes. The driver in the mirror was already staring at me when I made eye contact with him. White got constricted as I clumsily looked away and took out my phone. Face turned pale when they saw a text message from the Uber app stating that the driver had just when I got to the pickup spot. The driver texted me to inquire where the man's eyes remained fixed on me as I glanced back up at the mirror. So I put my phone back in my pocket, reclined back, and shut my eyes. Once more I was frightened and freaked out, but I attempted to seem as though I knew nothing. After 30 seconds, I sensed the vehicle reducing speed, and when I looked out the window, I noticed that we were at a red light intersection. And as soon as the vehicle came to a stop, I opened the door and leaped out. He began driving halfway through the exit, which caused me to tumble onto the sidewalk, but I jumped up and ran away. And he drove off. I'm not sure who the dude was after that, but it seemed like he was traveling around on new, picking up random inebriated people waiting for Ubers on a year's night. Soy was simply too drunk to see many of the warning flags, such as the fact that we weren't even heading toward my house. To be completely honest, I should never have even gotten into the car without first checking my phone. I don't know where he would have taken me or what would have occurred. Story 6. Unidentified. On the first weekend of February, I was spending my days off from work at home. Everything was very normal. Then on Saturday, I believed I heard something in the midst of the day. It was a single thud coming from upstairs. Nothing particularly loud or frightening that I walked up to try if I could identify it, because I had never heard of it before, but I was unable anything. But I wasn't concerned and didn't give it any consideration for the remainder of the hours later. And as I sat on the couch to wind down for the evening in, I was just keeping my eyes open when I heard another thump that was nearly the same as the last time. I opened the door to the spare room and peered around, but nothing was there. The bedroom that was completely deserted, and gazed around without seeing anything, such as a home producing an odd noise or an animal on the roof. Sounds I went to bed that evening, and shortly after waking up the following day, I went downstairs as usual to prepare breakfast and coffee, but something didn't feel right. For example, it appeared as though the cereal and chips had been moved as I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen that I had in the pantry. But they clearly didn't appear to be where I left them, but I couldn't confirm that because I didn't intentionally try to recall the order they were in or anything. I had a strange feeling that something wasn't right, but I wasn't sure how. Possibly, I made an effort to focus more on things for the remainder of that morning, but I believe I ultimately forgot about it. I had to be mistaken for the remainder of that day because I was preoccupied with how impossible it would have been that it was shortly after sunset when I went downstairs to watch TV and do some chores, and I got up to go check on it after hearing the identical thought once more as usual. But as I got closer to the steps, I heard a very faint click, but I knew it was some sort of click. Reached the top of the stairs, listened for a moment, and then searched my bedroom without finding anything before going across. I took the handle and went to the guest bedroom, thinking I might as well double check. But he turned it, but it was locked from the other side and stopped in the middle. My heart ached from the abrupt terror I experienced, and blood spurted from my cheeks that I felt like. My legs were giving out as I took a few shaky steps toward the door, but I collected myself as I heard footsteps coming from the opposite side of the door. I then began toes. I heard the door creak open after another click. I hurried back down the steps, omitting the front door. After they searched the house, they fled to the end of the block where I dialed 911. Present was a blanket and grocery bags in the spare bedroom closet. But no one else was present. At least for those 2 days, someone had been attempting to live there, but most likely longer without my knowledge. Most likely coming out at night when E was sleeping in order to go downstairs and eat, drink, and do anything else that makes me shiver. Fortunately, now that I think about it, they appear to have departed permanently. I never even considered what they would have done if I had discovered them that night. Don't wish to find out. Story 7. New Jersey. Music. I was spending the night indoors that was really chilly outside, and our town was experiencing a severe snowstorm. Ahadi was half asleep on the couch with my comfort program on TV when I heard footsteps outside my front door. Their boots were loud enough to rouse me awake and get my attention. So I looked at the door, but instead of knocking, they stayed there for short while before their boots took a few more steps before the noise abruptly stopped, sounding as though I stood up and gazed out after stepping off the porch into the snow, where I was unable to hear anything. The window was nearly entirely white, and the snowstorm was worse than I had anticipated it outside, making it difficult to see farther than a few feet beyond the window. Shoe prints were visible in the snow coming from the porch. Why did they just leave the porch like that? And given the current weather, why were they even outside? Since I was unable to find any more information, I looked for additional shoe prints on the side and rear windows in case. I went back to the couch and lay asleep after walking around my house, and finding very nothing. An hour or two passed. And even though I thought it was strange, I didn't want to overreact. And the only sounds outside were the gentle rumble of the blizzard, and the TV's low level gradually made my eyes weary, which caused me to when I finally woke up from sleep. It was still rather dark, and the television was on. The timeout screen indicated that it was 3 a.m. The snowfall continued to be intense, but oddly, as I woke up more, the noise level increased. I started recognizing that it was really loud, as if the sound was distinct and unmuffled by the windows. My eyes snapped open, and I stood up, turning on the nearby light, observing water stains across the space leading directly to the front door, which was there were boot prints highlighted in the open snow that was pouring into the home. I could somewhat see the same boot prints exiting the house as the water ran through the hallway. But to lock myself in the bathroom while I called for help, because I wasn't sure I had my phone. As it turned out, the intruder had already fled. It appeared that they entered and searched for a specific item, but were unable to locate it, so they simply returned to the blizzard was in my house, and they either failed to see me on the couch or silently passed me while scanning my house without even waking me. I haven't slept well, and the thought of it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Thereafter, waking up in the middle of the night, repeatedly frightened by every little creak. Story 8. Hallie. Music. My parents continued to work even though school was out right before Christmas. When I was an only child, I had the entire house to myself and could do this with simply another weekday. So I could do whatever I wanted all day long while they were out. why parents departed for work at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, I believe, and I started my PC in my bedroom. And barely 15 or 20 minutes after the parents had left, a knock on the front door was heard by a young person who was not accustomed to addressing the door by myself. I decided to ignore it and try to keep quiet for the following few minutes, because two hoped they would simply leave since I didn't want them to believe anyone was home. When I heard no more knocks, two carried on with my day, spending a lot of time playing video games. Honestly, it took me 3 or 4 hours straight before I even got out of my eye, walked downstairs to prepare breakfast at my desk, grab a bag of cereal, and began to walk back to take it upstairs. I found it strange that the front door was unlocked, because my folks typically exit through the garage and always remember to lock it. I believe it was around 1 or 2 p.m. But I went over and slid the lock down before heading back up to my room. I immediately returned to gaming after eating, having just reopened my game dot and entered a fresh match. But it was only 3 minutes later that I sensed something. I shook my desk and heard nothing. But since I was wearing a headphone, it was improbable that would have, but it seemed more like a vibration unless it was extremely loud. Most of the time, I would simply sense my parents shutting a door or anything. I took my turning off the headset. I listened to the bedroom door to see what might have caused it. That's silently. I stood up, opened the door, and then glanced down the corridor in the direction of the stairs once more, listening for anything. And then hearing nothing, I thought the heater could have turned on, but I couldn't help but notice how the door was unlocked earlier, which simply made me anxious. I went to the stairs and noticed a shadow move close to the bottom as soon as I reached the top and peered down. Froze. And then, as if they had seen something, the shadow stopped moving as well. My heart was racing, and I felt as though I had been still for a full minute. Prior to the shadow shifting once more, I could hear footsteps approaching the rear of the house, followed by the silent opening and closing of the rear door. And then in silence, I hurried to my parents' bedroom and used the home phone police to dial 911. Followed a few minutes later, and even though there were no indications of it, this simply appeared to get stranger and more unsettling. The front door, which was still locked when the police arrived, unless the intruder had picked it. Came, indicating that he most likely entered during the 3 to 4 hours I was while I'm gaming. I also remember the knocks I heard immediately following my parents' departure. However, I simply cannot understand why they remained inside for so long. He was nearly unquestionably present as I went downstairs to prepare a bowl of cereal for myself, though perhaps even observing me from a different room, concealed somewhere, and his motives are unknown. However, since then, I've never felt completely secure. Grant D. In Story 9. I spent 2 years working at a petrol station. Beginning in the winter of my first year in 2015, a frequent client of mine came in since I frequently worked nights. If someone came in more than time, Edie typically identified them. This man, who informed me his name was Paul, was a truck driver. I was a pretty pleasant guy, but he had a distinct personality since he was constantly smiling, almost too much and joyful, especially considering that it's the middle of the night. Sometimes I thought it was eerie. One evening, he entered and greeted me, but as he glanced about, he was acting strangely. His expression was lifeless and somewhat irate as he chose an energy drink and approached the counter, and his expression abruptly returned to its joyful state, but I could detect fear in his eyes, but in a way, making his smile appear even more phony and unsettling. I had all but forgotten about it until he paid, went to his truck, and drove away. When I saw his pickup pulling again the following day, it was snowing and quite cold. Paul had the same expression as yesterday when he entered from outside, but he didn't. He approached the counter, took the first drink from the shelf, and grinned broadly. He began asking me questions as he was paying, such as how busy he was tonight, and he asked if I would mind before leaving once my shift ended. Having known him for a long time, I assisted him in lifting something in his truck. Putting on my jacket and following him, I agreed that I wanted to be helpful. Except for his pickup parked on the far side of the petrol station, the area outside was deserted. I trailed him to the parking lot, where he unlocked the passenger door. Before walking, he gestured that it was just up here as he went around to the driver's side and got in.it was one of those large boxes. So I climbed up and sat down so I could enter as well. Trucks with a cargo area access door below the seats. I glanced at Paul, who had that unusual broad smile once more. It's just where he'll follow you." He gestured toward the door. I became quite uneasy and felt that this wasn't what he had spoken. So I sat there attempting to ascertain, unsure what to say or do, and I started to detect a strong Andy look back up at the door and saw something horrible coming from whatever the hell was behind it. Paul's expression was tight. Yet he continued to smile while he waited for me that I hurriedly slammed the door behind me and leaped back out of the truck to get moving. He didn't pursue me as I hurried back inside the station, but too thought I heard him yell from the truck like he was frustrated. The sound he made when he pulled out of the gas station was mostly muffled by the wind. That I worked there for another year shortly after, but Paul never returned. I am not sure what was actually happening with Paul or what was back there, but to consider myself fortunate not to have to look for. Story 10. WKI was traveling across the nation by car to my family's home for Christmas. I'm aware that it is probably not a good idea to drive that far in the winter. Fantastic concept. But I had to bring my dog, Frankie, who is only a small wiener, because I couldn't find anyone to watch him. Dog. So I opted to drive him down for the first part of the journey because I assumed he would be afraid of flying. Everything went smoothly, with no problems, beautiful weather, simple driving, and Nwasha was in the morning of the second drive, but I packed up despite waking up to a lot of snow falling swiftly and made an effort to beat the weather, but it appeared to only become worse when I got halfway to IT was taking too long, and I wouldn't there by nightfall, so I decided to rent a motel instead. Instead, there wasn't much of anything on the road I was on, and it was somewhat deserted, with the exception of a gas station every 50 miles or so. So when I drove off, as soon as I saw a motel sign and entered the parking lot, was a really old-looking structure with mostly dead lights. But I assumed it was because there was another automobile parked here that I left the car running for Frankie while I got out and went through the eye wiped. But the door wouldn't open up to the main entry in the blizzard. I tried to peer through the glass to check whether anyone was inside after clearing the fog from the outside and bringing my face closer. Booty wasn't sure what to think because it appeared dark and empty. Booty was running out of time when I heard Frankie growl. So I turned to see, too, the way the men approached me after passing my car made it obvious that something was incorrect. I attempted to ignore them and begin heading back to my car, but they cut hay. Was the place open? No. I believe it's closed for the evening. I apologize. I was attempting to avoid them. Do you believe you could assist us? Perhaps you could spare some gas if you're having some automotive problems? It seemed like they were arguing with me for no apparent reason. So I said no, then backed off and Medea a broad walkway around them. Yet they continued to attempt to obstruct me as their footsteps crunched rapidly behind me. I raced back into my car. Frankie had already arrived at my window when I entered and shut the doors, and I couldn't hold it against him. This was quite uneasy and somewhat frightening because we were so far out on an empty road that one of them kept knocking on my window, was still pleading for assistance. But it was clear that he didn't require any and I backed up and drove out onto the road before things got worse since I thought this was just a trap or something. Main road. And after considerable consideration, I decided to call 911 to report their behavior. 20 minutes later, I received a call from an officer stating that they were no longer in the parking lot. And if that doesn't mean that, neither was their vehicle. Scream guilty, I'm not sure what's going on with their car, which obviously worked well enough for them to depart. And it seems that they did so immediately after I did, more so than my brief exchange, that I'm horrified by the idea of what the men might have been attempting to do if something had happened that I doubt that I would have been discovered out there.